When I opened the door that night and saw his face again, I thought the ghost had finally learned to wear skin. That's how it began, the moment the past came knocking. Drenched in rain, trembling like the years hadn't passed at all. My name is Ruth, and if you're here with me, my dear, sit closer. This old heart still beats for the ones who listen. I don't tell this story often, not because I've forgotten, but because remembering costs more than forgetting ever did. This house remembers everything. The laughter that once filled its rooms, the arguments whispered behind closed doors, and the day he left me, with nothing but a letter and the faint scent of another woman's perfume clinging to his coat. I was 27 then, still foolish enough to believe that love was stronger than pride. His name was Thomas Hale, the man I once called my forever. We built this house with our hands, every brick laid with promises. But promises, my dear, can rot faster than wood when watered by lies. I remember that last morning like it happened yesterday. He stood by the window, the light painting his silhouette in gold, as if the heavens wanted me to remember him that way. And then, with trembling lips, he said the words that broke me in two. "Ruth," he said softly, "I can't do this anymore. I've fallen in love with someone else." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply turned to the kettle, poured 2 cups of tea, and whispered, "Then go." That's the strange thing about heartbreak. It isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of the clock ticking after he's gone. That night, I folded his clothes neatly into a suitcase. I left the letter he'd written on top of them. I couldn't bring myself to read it then. I told myself I didn't need to. But for years, that envelope haunted me from the bottom drawer of my dresser, whispering my name every time I opened it. The days that followed were cruel. People in town pretended not to stare, but their silence was sharper than their gossip. I heard the whispers anyway, that he had gone to London, that she was younger, that she wore red even to church. And yet, every night, I lit the same lamp by the window, just in case he ever wanted to find his way back home. My dear, before I go on, if this story has touched your heart even a little, do subscribe and stay with me through the end. Stories like this, they hurt less when shared. The seasons changed, but the house never did. I tried to rebuild myself in its quiet corners. I taught piano lessons to children. I grew roses in the garden he once promised to fence. Every time the wind blew through the cracks, I told myself it was just the weather, not the sound of him returning. But at night, I dreamed of his voice, of the way he used to say my name, as if it was something sacred. One autumn evening, nearly 2 years after he'd gone, a neighbor stopped by with a newspaper folded under her arm. She tried to look casual, but I could see it in her eyes before she spoke. "Ruth," she said, "did you hear? Thomas is getting married." I smiled politely, took the paper, and shut the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly unfold it. And there he was, my Thomas, smiling beside her. She looked radiant, younger, alive in a way I no longer was. That night I sat by the window again. I didn't light the lamp this time. I just watched the dark swallow the road where he once walked away from me. I whispered a prayer I didn't believe in anymore. Not for him to return, but for the ache to stop. Years passed. The roses grew wild, creeping over the fence he never built. My hair turned silver. The laughter that once echoed through this house became nothing more than memory. And then one morning, out of nowhere, I found the courage to open that letter. It was short, only a few lines. He wrote that he still loved me, but he couldn't fight what he felt for her. He said I deserved someone who wouldn't leave, and he ended it with, "One day, if fate allows, I'll come back to you and make things right." I laughed when I read that line, not out of joy, but out of disbelief. Fate, I thought, is a cruel storyteller. It gives you hope just to take it away again. I tucked the letter back where it belonged and carried on with life as best I could. But life, my dear, has a strange way of circling back to what we thought we'd buried. 20 years passed before I saw him again. And when I did, it was already too late. Tell me, have you ever forgiven someone who broke your heart? I'd love to hear your story too, because forgiveness, I've learned, isn't something you give for their sake. It's what you do to set your own heart free. It was an evening like any other, quiet and colorless, when fate decided to knock again. I was sitting by the fire, knitting a scarf I'd never wear, when a letter arrived. No return address, just my name, Mrs. Ruth Hale, written in handwriting that trembled between the lines of memory and regret. I knew that handwriting. My heart knew before my mind would admit it. It was Thomas. For a long time, I couldn't open it. My hands just hovered above the paper, afraid that inside might be the final ending I'd never asked for. But curiosity and love are twin devils, my dear. They always find a way to make you surrender. So, I broke the seal. He wrote that he'd been living in London all these years, that life hadn't been kind, and that his wife, yes, the woman he left me for, had passed away after a long illness. He said he couldn't stop thinking about me, that he wondered if the roses still grew by the window, that he wanted to see me once more. My heart betrayed me in that moment. It beat like it hadn't in decades. I hated myself for smiling, for hoping. I whispered, "No, Ruth, don't you dare." But somewhere deep inside, the young woman I used to be woke up again, brushing dust off her broken heart. For days, I tried to ignore the letter. I tucked it under the clock, then under the vase, then finally under the floorboard by my bed. But it kept calling to me. I'd hear it every night, like a voice inside the wind saying, "He's coming back." A week later, I received another envelope. This time, it wasn't from him. It was from a man named Dr. Faraday, a physician from London. He wrote that Thomas had been in poor health, and that before he was admitted to hospital, he'd asked the doctor to find me. His only wish, he said, was to speak to me once more before his time ran out. My dear, can you imagine what that does to a heart that's already learned to live without him? To know that the one who left now wants to return, not to stay, but to say goodbye. I sat there, staring at the fire, feeling the weight of 2 decades pressing against my chest. I didn't know if I could bear to see him again, but something inside me whispered that fate had finally come to collect its debt. I wrote back to the doctor. I told him to bring Thomas here, to the house we built, to the home he abandoned. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe because I wanted answers. Maybe because I wanted him to see what he'd left behind. Or maybe, just maybe, because some wounds never stop bleeding until they've seen the one who caused them. 3 days later, the carriage arrived. The sound of wheels on gravel felt like the echo of my past, rolling back into my life. I stood by the window, my hands trembling, as I saw 2 men lift him out. He was thinner, frailer, his once dark hair now silver like mine. For a moment, I didn't recognize him, but when he looked up, even from that distance, I saw the same eyes that had haunted me for years. He didn't speak when they brought him in, just smiled weakly and whispered, "You still keep the lamp by the window." My throat tightened. I wanted to tell him I kept it lit for myself, not for him, but we both knew that would be a lie. We sat in silence for a long time. The house, once so full of life, seemed to hold its breath. He looked around, his eyes lingering on every corner, every memory. "It hasn't changed," he said softly. "Not much has," I replied. He reached out his hand, and I hesitated. Then I took it. His skin was cold, paper thin, fragile like the years that had passed between us. He said he'd thought of me every day, that not a single sunrise went by without regret. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to shout, "You had your chance." But the tears came before the words did. "My dear," he said, "I've lived long enough to learn that love doesn't end when we walk away. It just waits, for courage or for forgiveness." I looked into his eyes and saw the man I loved, buried under time and guilt. And in that moment, I realized something cruel. yet beautiful. Sometimes the people who break us are the only ones who can make us whole again. But fate, as always, had its own design. That night, as he slept in the room across the hall, the same room where he once promised me forever, I found another letter in his coat pocket. It wasn't addressed to me. It was sealed and worn, the edges torn by time. The name on it wasn't mine. It was hers, the woman he left me for. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. My breath caught in my chest. What was he still holding on to? Why bring her letter here to our home? I told myself I wouldn't read it. I even placed it back in his pocket. But as the clock struck midnight, something inside me whispered that the truth had waited long enough. So I opened it. The handwriting was weak, barely legible, written in fading ink. It said, "Thomas, if you ever return to Ruth, tell her the truth. She deserves to know before I'm gone." I froze. The truth? What truth? My hands trembled as I reread those words. It felt like the walls of the house shifted, like it knew something I didn't. When I looked back toward the hallway, the lamp by his door flickered once, and then went out. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment fate revealed its cruelest secret. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the envelope on my lap, those words echoing in my mind again and again. She deserves to know the truth. What truth could possibly still matter after 20 years? He had already broken me once. What more could be left to break? At dawn, I made tea for two out of habit, the way I used to. The steam rose between us, like ghosts trying to bridge the distance that time had carved. Thomas was still asleep in the next room. For a moment, I watched him through the half-open door. His chest rose and fell slowly, like an old clock still clinging to its rhythm. He looked peaceful, almost holy, as if life had forgiven him before I ever could. When he finally woke, I asked him about the letter. I didn't mention that I'd read it. Not yet. I simply said, "You brought something with you. A letter." His expression changed, just slightly, but enough for me to see the weight behind his eyes. He said quietly, "It wasn't meant for you to find. Not yet." I felt anger crawl back up my throat, the kind that tastes of dust and years of silence. "After all this time, you still keep secrets from me," I said. He shook his head, his voice trembling. "It's not what you think, Ruth. Please, let me explain when I can stand on my feet again. My heart, it's not what it used to be." So I waited. I told myself patience was strength, though it felt more like surrender. I spent the next few days tending to him, feeding him soup, reading to him by the window, pretending that the years between us hadn't turned to stone. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he just stared into nothing, whispering names I didn't recognize. On the third night, as rain tapped softly against the glass, he called for me. His voice was weak, but there was urgency in it. "Ruth," he said, "do you remember the summer of 1965? I nodded slowly. "Of course I do. That was the year we built the garden shed. The year we tried to grow lavender and failed miserably." He smiled faintly. "It was also the year she came to visit. Clara, my cousin's wife." My stomach tightened. I remembered her, vaguely. A bright, lively woman with curious eyes and a laugh that filled every room she entered. "What about her?" I asked. He hesitated, his hand clutching the bedsheet. "Ruth, I wasn't honest with you then. Clara wasn't my cousin's wife. She was his sister, and she wasn't just a visitor. She was looking for someone." I frowned. "Looking for who?" He met my gaze, his eyes glistening. "Her daughter." Something inside me shifted. Her daughter. What does that have to do with us? He took a deep breath. "Everything." My heart began to pound. He looked away, his voice breaking. "When you and I first married, I told you that before we met, I'd made mistakes. You thought I meant youthful foolishness, flirtations, carelessness. But I never told you what really happened." I didn't move. I just let him speak, afraid that if I interrupted, the truth might vanish again. He said, "Years before I met you, I was engaged to a woman named Clara Hale. Yes, the same Clara. We were young, reckless, convinced the world would bend for us. But one night she disappeared. No one knew why. Months later, I received a letter saying she'd had a child. My child. She begged me never to look for her, saying the child would be better off without me. I felt cold, though the fire still burned. You mean to tell me, I whispered, that you had a daughter before me? That, all these years, he nodded, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. I thought she was gone, Ruth. I thought both of them were. But then I met you. You saved me from myself. I told myself the past was dead. But I lied. To you and to myself. I stood there trembling. So the woman you left me for, it wasn't Clara. He shook his head. No, the woman I left you for was her daughter. The room spun. I couldn't breathe. What? He covered his face with his hands, sobbing. I didn't know, Ruth. I swear to you, I didn't know. She came to me under a different name. I met her in London. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't until after we married that Clara's old letter resurfaced. Her handwriting, her confession, and the dates aligned. By then, it was too late. I'd married my own blood. I took a step back, my knees nearly giving way. The world fell silent except for the sound of my heartbeat. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. He continued, when she found out the truth, it destroyed her. She couldn't bear it. She fell ill, consumed by guilt and grief. She begged me to come here, to tell you everything, to ask for forgiveness, not just for me, but for her. I stared at him, shaking my head in disbelief. Forgiveness? You built your life on lies, and you expect forgiveness. He reached out, but I stepped away. Ruth, please, I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I just wanted to see you again before I go. I wanted to hate him. Every part of me screamed to hate him. But beneath the horror, beneath the betrayal, there was still love. Damaged, buried, but alive. The kind of love that doesn't ask for logic, only understanding. I whispered, you should have told me then. He said, I couldn't bear to lose you twice, for the first time. I saw him not as the man who left me, but as a man punished by his own mistakes. A man trapped by fate, paying for sins he never intended to commit. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the old photograph of us on our wedding day. I touched the glass and whispered, you've haunted this house long enough, Thomas. But maybe it's time I stopped letting you. The next morning, he was gone. Not in the way I feared, but gone nonetheless. His bed was empty, his coat missing. Only the window was open, letting the cold air in. On the bedside table lay one last letter addressed to me. I opened it with trembling hands. It read, Ruth, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I couldn't stay under your roof, knowing what I've done, but I needed you to know that I never stopped loving you. If fate had been kinder, I would have grown old beside you. Tell the roses I'm sorry. I hope they bloom for you again. That was the last time I saw him alive. I searched for him everywhere that morning. His shoes were gone, his hat missing, and the gate was left open as if he'd walked straight into the fog and vanished with it. I called his name again and again, but only the echo answered me. The world was quiet, too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I walked down the road until the trees blurred into one another, my heart thudding like I was chasing a ghost. By the time the constable found him, it was too late. They said he'd been sitting by the river, the same river where we used to picnic when we were young. His coat was folded neatly beside him, the letter to me still in his pocket. They said he looked peaceful. I didn't believe them. Peace doesn't look like that. Peace doesn't leave questions behind. The doctor sent word a few days later. He told me Thomas had been sick longer than he'd admitted. A failing heart, he said. It was only a matter of time. I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was empty. It was as if fate had drawn a full circle. He'd left me once out of choice, and this time out of consequence. I buried him behind the house, near the roses. It felt right somehow. He had asked for forgiveness, and though I wasn't sure I could give it, I couldn't deny him that resting place. When I placed the last flower on his grave, I whispered, "You left me twice, Thomas, but this time, I'll try to let you go." For days afterward, the house was unbearably still. Every corner felt heavier, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. I thought the story had ended there. I thought the ghosts had finally found their peace. But fate wasn't done with me yet. A week after the funeral, I was cleaning his room when I found a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboard. Inside were photographs, old faded ones. Some I recognized from our early years together. Others I didn't, but one stopped me cold. It was a picture of a young woman, smiling, holding a child in her arms. On the back, in Thomas's handwriting, it said, "For Ruth, one day when it's safe to know." My hands shook as I read those words. The child looked about 5 years old, with eyes that mirrored my own. I couldn't breathe. My heart began to race as I flipped through the rest of the photographs. There were more of her, the little girl growing older in each one. Her features becoming clearer, more familiar. Then a letter, tucked at the bottom of the box, addressed to me. The ink had faded, but the message was still sharp enough to wound. "Ruth, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you. After Clara disappeared, I searched for years. I found the child she left behind, and I wanted to bring her home to you. But by the time I did, she'd been adopted by another family. I visited her often, from a distance, just to be sure she was safe. Her name was Emily. She had your kindness, your eyes. I couldn't take her from the only life she knew. So I watched from afar until she grew up. You met her once, though you didn't know. She was the young maid you hired for the summer in 1982. You liked her immediately, and I saw it in your face. You saw something familiar in her too. I never told you, because I feared you'd hate me for keeping her a secret. But she was ours, Ruth. She was the child fate gave us, and then took away." I dropped the letter, my knees giving way beneath me. I remembered that girl, quiet, graceful, always humming when she worked. She'd left suddenly one morning, saying she'd been offered a position in the city. I never saw her again. My child, my own flesh and blood. All those years I thought I'd never known the touch of motherhood, never heard a child call my name. And she had been right here, under my roof, and I hadn't even known. Tears blurred the room around me. I pressed the letter to my chest, whispering her name over and over. Emily, my Emily. For weeks I searched for her. I wrote to old addresses, called people in London, sent letters to anyone who might have known her. Most were returned unopened. Others never came back at all. It was as though she'd disappeared completely. Then one morning I received a reply. A woman named Margaret wrote to me from Sussex. She said she had once worked with an Emily Hale, who died in a car accident 3 years earlier. There were no family records, no next of kin listed. She had been buried quietly, without ceremony. I read the letter twice, before the meaning sank in. She was gone. The daughter I never knew I had, the child fate had hidden from me, was gone before I even knew to find her. That night, I sat by the window where the lamp once burned for Thomas. I lit it again, not for him, but for her. I imagined her smile, her laughter, her voice calling me, "Mother," even if it never happened. I whispered into the dark, "If you can hear me, Emily, I forgive you for not knowing me. I hope you were loved." And in that moment, for the first time in decades, I felt something lift inside me, a strange kind of peace, painful but pure. Perhaps fate isn't cruel after all. Perhaps it simply teaches us that love doesn't always come the way we expect. Sometimes, it hides in the corners of our lives, waiting to be seen before it slips away. My dear, if you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Stories like mine aren't told for pity. They're told because hearts like ours need to remember we're not alone. Tell me, have you ever lost someone before you had the chance to say what mattered most? I'd love to hear your story too. After I learned the truth about Emily, the house changed. Or maybe it was me. The walls seemed to breathe differently. The light fell in softer shades. And the silence. Oh, the silence felt almost alive. It's strange how grief reshapes the spaces we live in. It doesn't destroy them. It simply bends them around the emptiness we carry. I tried to go on with life as before. I still brewed my morning tea, still tended to the roses, though they never seemed to bloom the same way after Thomas was gone. But something in the air had shifted. Sometimes, when I passed her old room, the little room at the end of the hallway, I'd swear I heard humming, a soft familiar tune, the same one Emily used to hum while sweeping the kitchen floor. At first, I thought it was memory playing tricks on me, but one evening as I walked by, the door moved, just slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I stood frozen, my heart beating against my ribs like a frightened bird. "Emily," I whispered, before realizing how foolish that sounded. But the strangest part wasn't fear. It was calm, like the house itself was trying to tell me, "You're not alone anymore." I began finding small things out of place. The tea set on the counter with one cup missing. The old photograph of Thomas and me, moved slightly, tilted toward the window. Once, I found a fresh rose petal on my nightstand. Though the garden had long been barren for weeks, for a woman of reason, I should have dismissed it all. But reason doesn't stand a chance against longing. I started talking to her at night, as if she could hear me. I'd sit by the window, light the lamp, and whisper stories about the day she might have been born, about the lullabies I never got to sing, about how much I wished she'd known she was loved. One night, as I spoke, the flame of the lamp flickered 3 times and then steadied. It was a quiet, simple thing, but I took it as an answer. I don't know if it was her spirit, or just my heart desperate for connection. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel empty. I felt seen. My dear, before I continue, if this story has touched even a small corner of your heart, do subscribe and stay with me till the end. Some stories aren't just told, they're shared between souls. A few weeks later, I found another surprise. While sorting through Thomas's old chest in the attic, I discovered a small box I'd never seen before. Inside was a single gold locket, tarnished by time. When I opened it, I gasped. On one side was a photograph of a little girl, Emily smiling, holding a tiny kitten. On the other side, a lock of dark brown hair, curled and delicate, tied with a red ribbon. My fingers trembled as I touched it. Beneath the locket was a folded piece of parchment. In Thomas's handwriting, it read, "For Ruth, when she's ready to forgive herself. Forgive myself." The words struck something deep within me. What did I have to forgive myself for? He was the one who lied, who left, who kept the truth hidden. But as I stared at that small curl of hair, something inside me broke, because I realized I'd spent half my life waiting for him, and the other half blaming him. But I'd never allowed myself to grieve properly. I'd built my life on survival, not healing. That night, I placed the locket on the mantel and sat by the fire until morning. I thought of Emily again, of the woman she became, the life she lived without knowing who she truly was. And a thought came to me, so clear it almost felt whispered. Maybe she's still here. Maybe she came back because I finally know. From that night on, the house began to feel warmer. The air carried a softness I hadn't felt in years. The floors didn't creak as mournfully, and when I passed her room, the scent of lavender, her favorite, seemed to linger faintly in the air. Still, one part of me remained restless. The letter from Thomas had said he'd found Emily once, from afar. But there had been no mention of what happened to her after she left my home. If she had died, where was she buried? Who had claimed her? Why had there been no records? I decided to find out. I wrote to the parish in Sussex, where Margaret had said Emily had worked. Weeks passed with no answer. Then, one morning, I received a letter, not from the parish, but from a woman named Lydia. She said she had been Emily's closest friend, and her words chilled me to the bone. "Mrs. Hale," she wrote, "I believe Emily spoke of you often. She said there was a woman who felt like home, though she couldn't explain why. She told me she'd worked for you once, and that you reminded her of the mother she never knew. In her final days, she mentioned an old house by the hill, and she begged me to send her love to the woman who lived there, if anything ever happened to her. I'm sorry it took me this long to find you." I read that letter over and over, tears falling onto the paper. She knew, somewhere deep in her soul, she had known who I was. Even without the truth, she'd felt it. That invisible thread between mother and child had never broken. I placed Lydia's letter beside the locket and whispered, "You found your way back to me, my darling, even after all this time." From that moment, I began to dream of her often. Not nightmares, but gentle dreams. Of us walking in the garden together. Of her laughter echoing down the hall. Of her calling me Mama for the first and only time. And every time I woke, I could still hear her voice, soft and clear as morning light. Sometimes I wonder if the house itself held her spirit for me, keeping it safe until I was ready to face the truth. Because some nights when I sit by the fire, I can almost feel her presence beside me, not haunting, not sorrowful, just watching over me, like a child who never stopped loving her mother. Love doesn't vanish, my dear. It just changes rooms. After Lydia's letter arrived, I couldn't rest. Every word she wrote carried a weight that pressed softly against my heart, like a ghost's hand, reminding me that love never really leaves. For days, I wandered through the house as though following unseen footsteps, tracing the past that refused to stay buried. One evening, as twilight brushed its silver fingers across the curtains, I decided to open the last room in the house that had remained locked for decades. Thomas's old study. I hadn't stepped inside since the day he left. The key was still where he'd left it, hanging behind the clock. My hand trembled as I turned it in the lock. The smell of dust and cedar greeted me, mingled with something faint, his cologne, still clinging to the fabric of time. Papers lay stacked neatly on the desk, as if waiting for someone to finish reading them. And there, by the window, sat a small wooden chair. The cushion bore a sun-faded impression, the ghost of where he used to sit, staring into the garden for hours. I walked to the desk and opened the drawer. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed and frayed, all addressed to me, each envelope sealed, none ever sent. My heart nearly stopped. With trembling fingers, I opened the first one. "My dearest Ruth," it began. "I see you every day in my mind, sitting by the roses, your hair lit by morning. I wish I had the courage to tell you sooner. Emily was our daughter. I didn't mean to hide it forever. I only wanted to protect you from the shame, from the whispers that would follow. But now, it is I who carries the shame. She looks like you when she smiles." I sank to the floor, the letter shaking in my hands. So it was true. He had known. He had loved her. And he had hidden her existence, not out of malice, but out of cowardice dressed as love. Letter after letter, he confessed everything. How he'd searched for Emily after she left. How he'd stood outside her cottage one evening, but couldn't bring himself to knock. How he'd planned to return to me when he found the courage to tell the truth. But fate, cruel as ever, had stolen his chance. In the final letter, written only weeks before his death, he said something that still echoes in my mind. I see her in my dreams. "Ruth," she calls your name, not mine. "I think she knows. Forgive me, my love. And if there is mercy left in this world, forgive yourself too. For neither of us were villains, only lost souls caught in time's cruel game." I pressed those letters to my chest and wept until the candle burned out. For the first time, I didn't cry out of anger or heartbreak. I cried because I understood. He hadn't betrayed me out of hatred. He had betrayed me out of fear. The same fear that lives in all of us. The fear of losing the people we love by telling the truth they deserve. My dear, before I go on, if you're still here listening, tell me, have you ever kept a truth because you thought it might protect someone, only to lose them because of it? If you have, know this: silence can wound more deeply than words ever could. The following morning, I went to the garden. The air was still, the sky soft with mist. I carried the letters and the locket to the small patch beneath the old oak tree, the one Thomas used to sit under when he read aloud to me. I dug a little hollow in the earth and placed them inside. "This is where we'll rest," I whispered. All of us, together at last. The wind picked up gently, swirling the leaves around me, and for a brief, breathtaking moment, I saw something shimmer by the window. A faint outline, like a woman in a pale dress, watching with kind eyes. Emily. I didn't move. I simply smiled and said, "You can go now, darling. You're home." And then, as quickly as she appeared, she was gone, leaving only the scent of lavender behind. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. I dreamed of a little girl in the garden, her laughter like sunlight through rain. Thomas stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, both of them smiling at me. There was no sorrow, no pain, only peace. When I woke, morning light spilled across the floor, and I knew the house had finally exhaled. The weight was gone. The shadows no longer clung to the corners. Even the clock, which had stopped ticking long ago, began to move again. Tick, 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 as if time itself had forgiven us. I walked to the mirror and saw my reflection. Older, softer, lined with years of love and regret. But for the first time, I didn't see a woman abandoned or betrayed. I saw a woman who had lived, who had loved, and who had survived the unbearable. Love, my dear, is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it's felt, even when it ends, that day. I opened all the windows of the house and let the wind carry everything away. The dust, the secrets, the guilt. And as the curtains fluttered like wings, I whispered to the empty air, "I forgive you, Thomas. And I forgive myself. Sometimes I still feel them here. Not haunting, not sad, but resting." The house no longer feels lonely. It feels full of memories, of forgiveness, of echoes that no longer hurt. And in the quiet evenings, when I light a candle and the flame dances gently, I imagine them both smiling somewhere beyond the veil. Proud that I finally found peace in the place where pain once lived. Because in the end, my dear, fate didn't bring him back too late. It brought him back exactly when my heart was ready to forgive. I thought the story had ended there, with forgiveness, silence, and the house breathing easier after years of sorrow. But fate, my dear, has a peculiar way of turning still water into ripples, long after we believe the lake has settled. It was a grey afternoon when it happened, the kind of day when clouds hung low and the air carried the faint promise of rain. I was in the kitchen, preparing tea, one cup as always, when I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside the gate. Visitors had become rare in my old age, and rarer still were the unannounced ones. Through the lace curtain, I saw a figure standing by the iron gate, a woman, perhaps in her 30s, with a long beige coat and hair the color of honey in sunlight. Something about her posture, the way she hesitated before lifting the latch, made my heart flutter with unease. I stepped out to meet her. "Can I help you, dear?" I asked softly, wrapping my shawl tighter around my shoulders. She smiled politely, but there was a nervousness behind it. I hope so. I'm sorry for intruding. My name is Clara." The name didn't strike me at first, but her eyes, a stormy grey blue, the kind that seemed to hold secrets, made my knees feel weak. I was told you might know something about my grandmother, she continued. Her name was Emily. For a moment, time stopped. The world seemed to fold in on itself, every sound dimming, except for the faint pounding of my own heart. Emily, I whispered, almost afraid to believe it. Emily Hale? She nodded. Yes, she passed away when my mother was a little girl. I've been trying to trace her family history. There are no records, just fragments, old letters, and a photograph. This house, she looked around, eyes wide with wonder. It matches one from an old sketch she kept. I felt my breath catch. It was as if the past had found its way to my doorstep again. Wearing a new face, carrying the same eyes. Come in, dear, I said, opening the door slowly. There's a storm coming, and I think you've travelled a long way. As we entered the drawing room, the air felt different, thicker, charged. Clara moved as though she'd been there before, touching the edge of the piano, running her fingers along the mantel where the old locket still rested. This is strange, she murmured. Everything feels familiar. I poured her tea, trying to keep my hands steady. Tell me, Clara, what made you come here? There must have been something that led you to me, she nodded, setting her cup down. It was a letter. I found it in my grandmother's old chest. It wasn't signed, but it mentioned this house. It said, if ever you feel lost, find the woman who lives by the hill. She will tell you where your heart comes from. My throat tightened. That was Emily's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere. For a long while, we just sat in silence. The clock ticked softly in the background. Then Clara looked up at me, her expression full of quiet curiosity. Mrs. Hale, she said gently, forgive me for asking this, but who was my grandmother to you? The question sliced through the calm like a blade. I stared at her, this living echo of a girl I once loved and lost. And for the first time, I didn't know how to speak. How could I tell her that the woman she called grandmother was the daughter I had once buried in silence? Finally, I took her hand. She was someone very dear to me, I said softly. Someone I wronged by not knowing her sooner. Clara's eyes glistened. I felt that. I don't know how to explain it, but ever since I was a little girl, I've dreamt of this place. Of a woman sitting by the fire, telling stories. Her voice always sounded like yours. Her words made the hairs on my arms stand. Because for years, I had spoken to the air, to Emily's memory. Telling her stories I thought no one heard. My dear, I said, my voice trembling. Sometimes love travels through generations. It finds a way to return, even when we think it's gone. We spent the afternoon talking about Emily, about Clara's childhood, about the strange coincidences that had led her here, and with every word, the room seemed to grow warmer, as though the house itself was listening, grateful to be remembered. When she rose to leave, the rain had begun to fall, tapping gently against the windows. She turned to me at the door and said, I don't know why, but I feel like I've found something I didn't know I'd lost. I smiled. Maybe you have, child. Maybe we both have. As she walked away, I stood by the window watching her fade into the mist. I could have told her everything. That Emily was my daughter. That her mother was the child of the man who once broke my heart. But I didn't. Not yet. Some truths, I've learned, must unfold gently. Like dawn after a long night. That evening, as I sat alone by the fire, I heard it again. The faintest melody drifting through the house. A lullaby. The same one Emily used to hum. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I simply whispered, thank you. Because I knew now that Emily hadn't come back as a ghost to haunt me. She'd come back through Clara, through the living proof that love never dies. It just changes hands, and as the firelight flickered across the old portraits, I felt something stir inside me. Not sorrow, but purpose. For the first time in years, I wasn't just remembering the past. I was ready to share it. My dear, before I go on, if you've ever felt that someone you lost found their way back to you, in another time or another soul? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know if fate has whispered to you too. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every tick of the clock echoed through the house like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I sat by the window, watching the rain smear silver trails down the glass, and thought about Clara. Her eyes haunted me, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were too familiar. I had seen those eyes once before, in a newborn's face I never got to hold, and then again in the mirror, every time I forced myself to forget. All those years, I had prayed for closure, but fate had given me something far more complicated, another chance. The next morning, I awoke before dawn. The sky was the color of old paper, and a cold fog rolled over the garden like a ghostly tide. I went to the attic, where I'd stored the box of Emily's few remaining belongings. The ribbon she wore in her hair, her diary, the small brooch Thomas had once given her. As I lifted the box, something fell out. A photograph, faded and cracked at the edges. It was Emily, holding a baby in her arms, smiling shyly at the camera. On the back, written in her handwriting, were the words, "Clara, my heart, if you ever find this, know that you were loved twice. Once by me, and once by the woman who never got to say goodbye." My breath caught. She had known I would see it one day. It was her final forgiveness, her silent blessing, to let go of guilt. That afternoon, I wrote a letter to Clara. My hands trembled as I began. My dearest Clara, there is something I must tell you, something I've carried for most of my life. Your grandmother, Emily, was not only someone I cared for deeply, she was my daughter. I didn't know the truth until it was far too late. She was taken from me by circumstance and by the fear of a man I once loved more than life itself. If this truth hurts you, forgive me. But I believe you came to my door for a reason. Maybe fate chose you to free us both from silence. With all my love, Ruth. When I finished, I sealed the envelope and sat for hours, staring at it. The letter felt heavier than paper. It felt like a lifetime. I could post it. I could hand it to her myself. But something inside me hesitated. What if she hated me? What if the truth broke her world apart the same way it once broke mine? That evening, as I stood in the garden with the letter in my hand, the wind carried the faint scent of lavender again. And I swear, for a fleeting moment, I heard Emily's voice, soft, comforting, like when she used to hum, "Tell her, Mama," it whispered. She deserves to know. My tears fell freely then. I pressed the letter to my chest and whispered, "All right, my love. I'll tell her." The next morning, I asked Clara to visit again. When she arrived, I noticed how naturally she fit into the house now, as if she'd always belonged there. She sat across from me, her face calm but curious. "You said you had something to tell me," she said gently. I nodded. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the letter. "Yes, my dear. But before I do, I need you to promise you'll listen with your heart, not just your mind." She leaned forward. "I promise." I took a deep breath. Your grandmother, Emily, she wasn't just someone I once knew. She was my daughter. "And that makes you?" "My granddaughter." The silence that followed was thick, fragile, sacred. Clara's eyes widened, filling slowly with tears. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at me, as if trying to piece together 1,000 invisible threads all at once. When she finally did speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "You mean, all this time?" I nodded. "Yes, I didn't know until she was gone, and by the time I learned, it was too late to tell her. I kept the truth locked away out of shame. But I see now that silence only deepened the wound." Clara covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming freely now. Then she stood and walked to me. For a moment, I thought she might turn away. Instead, she knelt beside my chair and took my hand in hers. "You don't need to apologize," she said softly. "I think I already knew. I felt it the moment I saw you. It felt like coming home." Those words shattered something inside me, and in the pieces that fell, I found peace. I held her face in my hands, studying every line, every shadow that reminded me of Emily. You have her smile, I whispered, and her strength. And yours, she said, smiling through her tears, because we both survived what love tried to break. For the first time in decades, laughter, real, gentle laughter, filled the house again. It echoed off the walls, like light returning to a long-forgotten place. Later, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara stood by the door, ready to leave. I'll come back tomorrow, she said. There's so much I still want to know. You'll always have a place here, I told her. This house is yours as much as it's mine. After she left, I sat by the window once more, watching the sunset paint the garden in gold. And as the sky dimmed, I felt it. A warmth on my shoulder, like a hand resting there for just a second. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Emily, I smiled. We did it, my love, I whispered. She knows now. You can rest. The wind rustled the roses, and for the first time since Thomas left, I felt the purest kind of peace, the kind that comes not from forgetting, but from finally remembering everything. My dear, if this story has stayed with you till now, tell me, have you ever forgiven someone not because they asked for it, but because your heart couldn't carry the weight anymore? I'd love to hear your story. The days after Clara's visit passed like the gentle turning of pages in an old book. The house, once filled with silence and sorrow, now carried the sound of footsteps again. Lighter, younger, full of life. Clara began coming every weekend. She'd bring pastries from the village bakery and sit by the fire, listening as I told her stories about Emily, about the garden, about the way the rain used to sound on the roof when her mother was little. I could see pieces of Emily in her. The tilt of her head when she laughed, the kindness in her voice when she spoke of people she loved. But there was something else too, something I hadn't seen in a long time. The courage to face truth without running from it. Sometimes she'd walk through the house touching the walls, the old photographs, the piano keys, as if trying to memorize everything. I feel like I've been here before, she'd whisper, like I belonged here once. And every time she said it, I'd smile and say, maybe you always did. We began restoring the garden together. The earth was tired, the soil dry and stubborn, but Clara had patience. She'd kneel in the dirt, planting seeds with careful hands, humming softly under her breath, the same melody Emily used to hum. It was as if the song had found its way through blood, across generations, refusing to die. One afternoon, as we rested by the roses, Clara turned to me. Do you ever wish things had been different? She asked. I thought about that for a long time. Once I did, I said finally. For many years, I wished I could go back, change one decision, one word, one moment. But if I did, maybe you wouldn't be here. And that, my dear, would be too high a price for peace, she smiled, eyes glistening in the sunlight. You sound like my grandmother, I chuckled softly. That's because I was her once. In the evenings, we'd sit together in the drawing room, the fireplace crackling, the shadows dancing against the old wallpaper. I'd tell her about the man I once loved, Thomas, and how love, when it's real, never leaves you. It just changes its shape. She listened with a kind of quiet reverence, as though she was hearing not just my story, but her own history too. One night, as the rain tapped gently against the window, I said, you know, Clara, love isn't measured by who stays. It's measured by what remains after they've gone. And what remained for me was this house, these stories, and now, you. She didn't speak. She just leaned her head on my shoulder, and for a moment, the years disappeared. It felt like holding Emily again. The circle was closing, not in sorrow, but in peace. That night, I dreamt of Thomas once more. He stood by the oak tree, smiling, his hair touched by sunlight. Emily was beside him, her hand in his, her other hand reaching out toward me. They didn't speak, but I understood. It was their way of saying thank you. When I awoke, the morning light poured through the curtains like gold, and I realized something. The house no longer belonged to the past. It had become a bridge between what was and what still could be. My dear, before I continue, if this story has touched your heart, even for a moment, do subscribe and stay with me till the end, because the ending, oh, the ending, is not about loss at all. It's about what love leaves behind. Over the next few weeks, Clara began helping me record my stories. She said the world needed to hear them, that people out there, far beyond these hills, might find pieces of themselves in my words. So we sat by the fire, a small microphone between us, and I began to speak. My voice trembled at first, but as the words flowed, I felt a warmth spreading through me. It was as if the house itself was listening, holding its breath, grateful to finally have its story told. Clara would smile through tears as I spoke, and sometimes she'd reach over to squeeze my hand when my voice faltered. "You're giving her back to the world," she'd whisper. "You're giving her peace," I nodded. And maybe, in doing so, I'm giving myself peace too. The recordings became our little ritual. Every Friday evening, we'd light the candles, pour tea, and record another memory. The laughter, the heartbreak, the forgiveness. Each story stitched another patch of healing into the fabric of our lives. And sometimes, when we played the recordings back, I'd swear I could hear another voice faintly beneath mine. Soft, melodic, like someone humming in the background. Clara noticed it too. She'd look at me with wide eyes, and I'd smile. "She's listening," I'd say. She always is. There was no fear in that, only love, because I knew Emily wasn't haunting us. She was home. The morning the letter arrived, the sky was heavy with clouds. Clara found it tucked beneath the front door, old and yellowed, as though time itself had been holding it hostage. There was no return address, only my name, written in the familiar, trembling handwriting I hadn't seen in over 40 years. Thomas. My hand shook as I opened it. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but every word cut through me like it had been written yesterday. "My dearest Ruth," it began. "If this letter ever reaches you, it means I am gone. I wanted you to know that leaving you was the greatest mistake of my life. I searched for forgiveness in the wrong places, and by the time I found it, it was too late. I never stopped loving you. I see you in every sunrise, in every gentle thing this world has left. If there is a life after this one, I hope it begins with you." I read it again and again, the tears falling onto the paper, smudging the words until they blurred into one another. For so many years, I had hated him. Then I had missed him. Then I had simply learned to live without him. But now, reading his words, I felt something else. Understanding. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my heart. "You are late, Thomas," I whispered. But love doesn't keep time. When I showed it to Clara, she cried too. Not because of the letter itself, but because she saw in it what I had lost, and what she had found. "He came back," she said softly. Even if it wasn't in time, that night I couldn't sleep. The rain had returned, soft and steady, like an old lullaby. I walked through the house. The same corridors, the same photographs, but everything looked different now. Brighter somehow, warmer. In the study the fire was still burning low. I sat by it and took out my journal, the one I had kept hidden all these years. Inside were pages filled with love letters I never sent, apologies I never spoke, dreams I never chased, and at the very end a blank page waited, untouched. Expectant, I picked up my pen and began to write. "To whoever finds this house, long after I am gone, know that every brick here has felt love, loss, forgiveness, and rebirth. This home was not built with stone and timber. It was built with hearts that broke and healed again. If you ever find yourself standing by the old oak tree, listen closely. You'll hear laughter, you'll hear rain, you'll hear the voices of everyone who ever loved deeply and lost bravely. That is what this place holds. That is what I leave behind. When I finished writing, the fire had nearly gone out, but I felt lighter than I had in decades. I closed the book, placed it beside the letter, and smiled. My story was complete. The next morning, Clara found me in the garden, sitting beneath the oak tree. My hands were folded in my lap, my eyes closed, the faintest smile on my lips. She said it looked like I was listening to someone, like I was mid-conversation with the wind. And perhaps I was, because I heard Thomas calling my name. I heard Emily's laughter. I felt peace in a way I never had before. Clara buried the letter and my journal beneath the oak tree. She kept the house, just as I had hoped she would. She turned it into a sanctuary for stories. For people who had lost, loved, and still dared to believe. Years later, strangers would come from faraway countries, walking through its halls, listening to the recordings I made with her. They'd sit by the fire, and my voice, old and soft, would whisper through the speakers. "Welcome, my dear. Sit down. I have a story to tell you." And so, my voice lived on. My story lived on. My love lived on. If you stayed with me till the end, my dear, thank you. Tell me the time and country you're watching from in the comments. It warms my old heart, knowing where my stories travel.